Okay, so you've shared some really quite dense but important sources with us. Materials looking at Islamic theology specifically, how Allah is understood and what salvation really means within Islam.
That's right.
And the idea here for this deep dive is to get past the surface level, right? To really try and grasp the core ideas as these texts present them.
Exactly. And we've got quite a mix. There are bits from the Encyclopedia of Islam, The Reliance of the Traveler, which the notes describe as a major Islamic law manual reflecting scholarly consensus, or ijma.
Right, ijma. That concept seems key.
It is. It's the unanimous agreement of the scholars, and that holds a lot of authority in Islamic understanding, according to these sources. Plus, of course, references to the Quran and Hadith and analysis tying it all together.
So our mission then is to unpack all this. What are Allah's characteristics according to these sources? How does salvation work? And what's the role of jihad in that picture?
And maybe crucially, what are the implications? You know, the real world side of this theology, thinking about examples like Syria in 2025, or even trends in the West.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with Allah's nature.
Yeah, let's start there. The analysis we have kicks off by describing Allah as, well, vigilant, punitive, and authoritative.
Okay.
And it brings up a verse from the Quran right away, Surah Al-Fajr, verse 14. Verily, your Lord is ready at ambush.
Ready at ambush. It's quite a striking phrase.
It is. And the sources dig into the Arabic word mitad. It apparently doesn't just mean passively watching. It suggests a deliberate strategic readiness, like setting a trap almost for wrongdoers.
So an active, watchful presence preparing to act.
That's the picture painted. And the material mentions Ibn Kathir's commentary emphasizing this constant vigilance. Nothing gets missed.
It definitely creates a specific feeling, doesn't it? Not just aware, but poised.
And the context in that surah, Al-Fajr, verses 11 to 13, just before that, they give examples.
Right, the destruction of ancient peoples.
Exactly. Peoples described as rebelling, and their destruction is presented as, evidence of divine punishment in action. It's not just abstract.
So there's a historical precedent laid out right there in the scripture for this punitive aspect.
Precisely. Then the analysis moves to another point. What about those who oppose the messenger? Or don't follow the believer's way?
Yeah, that ties into other verses mentioned, like Quran 9.29 about fighting certain non-believers until they pay the jizya tax.
And 4.115.
Right, 4.115, which talks about pretty dire consequences, hell, basically, for opposing the messenger and straying from that path. It sounds like there's very little room for deviation.
That's the strong impression. Opposing the messenger is framed as opposing Allah himself. So deviating isn't just a disagreement, it's a major theological problem with eternal consequences.
So putting those pieces together, the vigilance, the readiness to punish, the demand for following the specific path, it builds a picture of absolute authority demanding strict obedience.
Yeah, an active enforcer, you could say. And the material even touches on Al-Ghazali's view.
The influential thinker.
Right. His idea that Allah's will isn't actually bound by human ideas of morality. And questioning that's considered blasphemy, according to the analysis.
Wow. Okay. So that really underlines the absolute unquestionable nature of that authority.
Yeah.
So given this understanding of Allah, vigilant, punitive, absolute authority, how does that shape the idea of salvation in Islam? Especially compared to, say, Christianity?
That's a crucial link. The analysis makes a direct contrast. In Christianity, it points to salvation through faith in Jesus' atonement.
Okay.
But in Islam, as presented here, salvation is tied fundamentally to submission. I mean, that's what Islam means, and doing good deeds. But, and this is key, there's no absolute guarantee of paradise just through belief alone.
That uncertainty.
Yeah.
Feels like a really important point. The text mentions Quran 49.1415, distinguishing between just outward submission, Islam, and real inner faith, iman.
Right, suggesting the outward act isn't necessarily enough.
And then there's that hadith, Sahih Muslim 28:16, saying deeds alone don't get you into paradise. It ultimately depends on Allah's mercy.
Exactly, which, as the analysis suggests, creates this pressure, this need to strive to somehow earn or secure that divine favor.
Which leads us to jihad.
Precisely. This is where jihad enters the picture as a potentially decisive factor for salvation. The analysis quotes Quran 61.11-12.
What does that say?
It promises forgiveness of sins and paradise for believers who strive. The word used implies jihad with their wealth and their lives.
So striving, potentially through fighting, is presented as a way to secure forgiveness and paradise.
It elevates that act significantly, linking it directly to one's eternal fate. And the material highlights Ibn Taymiyyah's view, too.
Another major scholar. What did he emphasize?
He drew on Quran 9.111. That verse describes Allah making a transaction, essentially, buying believers' lives and property in exchange for paradise.
On the condition that they fight in his cause.
Exactly. So, in his interpretation, as presented here, military jihad seems almost like a guaranteed ticket to paradise. It's a very different framing from salvation purely through grace.
Okay, so let's pause and connect the dots. We have this view of Allah watchful, ready to punish deviation. And then this path to salvation where deeds matter, mercy is needed. But jihad is presented as a powerful, maybe even guaranteed way to gain paradise.
Right. And the analysis then explores the logical consequences of that combination.
Which are?
Well, the argument presented is that this framework can potentially encourage conflict. If Allah punishes deviation and jihad earns paradise, then enforcing Allah's will, even by force, becomes, well, religiously incentivized.
And the analysis gives a contemporary example, Syria 2025.
Yes, the takeover of Aleppo by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. It identifies them as having a Salafi jihadist ideology.
And their action.
Reports mentioned in the source material talk about executions of Alawites and Christians, groups they see as deviating. And their leader, al-Jilani, is cited as invoking Quran 9.29, the verse about fighting non-believers.
So for the fighters themselves, this isn't just politics.
According to this analysis, no. It's seen as fulfilling that promise in Quran 61.11, striving for Allah, earning paradise. The uncertainty of salvation otherwise seems like a powerful driver.
But the implications aren't just in conflict zones, right? The analysis also talks about the West in 2025.
Yeah, more subtle manifestations. Things like the potential for insularity in some Muslim communities, self-segregation, the presence of Sharia councils operating alongside Western law. It references a UK Home Office report from 2023 on that.
That sounds linked to the doctrine of al-wala wal-bara mentioned in the text. Loyalty and disavowal.
Exactly. Loyalty to fellow believers and animosity or disavowal towards non-Muslims with reference to Quran 5.51 that can obviously create challenges for social cohesion.
And sometimes, sadly, it's not subtle. The analysis mentions the stabbing in Marseille, January 2025.
Right, where the attacker reportedly claimed jihad for Allah. It's presented as an example of how that promise of paradise through jihad can motivate violence even in Western contexts.
So the analysis sort of boils this down to a theological loop. Is that the term used?
Yeah, basically. Allah demands obedience, punishes dissent, Quran 89.13 and 4.115. Salvation isn't guaranteed, pushing believers towards acts seen to earn favor, like jihad, Quran 61.11, 9.111. Therefore, violence can become viewed as religious duty.
And the argument is that groups like HTS in Syria are, in their view, just literally applying these texts.
That's how the analysis presents it, not necessarily a fringe distortion, but a logical outcome of taking these specific texts and doctrines literally.
And in the West, it might manifest as parallel societies, or occasionally these violent outbursts.
That's the connection being made. But hang on, if jihad is so central, why isn't every Muslim involved in fighting? That's a common question. The material addresses that. It brings up the doctrine of collective obligation, fard kifaya. The idea is that if a sufficient small minority performs the duty of jihad, the rest of the community is absolved.
Ah, okay, so it's not necessarily seen as an individual requirement for everyone at all times.
Correct. But the analysis stresses that jihad, especially military jihad, remains a highly prioritized doctrine in the texts and history discussed. Its presence drives conflict either actively or through the internal pressure for the community to fulfill the obligation.
And the core difference remains that lack of a guaranteed, nonviolent path to salvation, unlike some other faiths.
That's highlighted as a key distinction, yeah. It keeps jihad relevant as a potential path in this framework.
So, okay, stepping back, why does understanding all this matter now?
Well, the analysis suggests a risk in the West of maybe overlooking these theological specifics, assuming a sort of religious equivalence, like Allah is just the same as the God of the Bible, but with a different name.
Which ignores these core differences in the concept of salvation.
Exactly. It contrasts it directly with concepts like salvation by grace, citing Ephesians 2.8-9 from the New Testament. The argument is that the Islamic framework presented here, Allah's punitive nature, jihad's role in salvation logically leads, or can lead, to different outcomes. A theology that, this analysis claims, can incentivize conflict.
And the sources are careful to frame this not as, stirring up hatred, but as needing to understand a reality with real-world consequences.
Yes, it's presented as understanding for the sake of awareness, even survival. And it loops back to that first verse.
Quran 89.14, Verily your Lord is ready in ambush.
Presenting it not just as a metaphor, but, according to these interpretations, as a call to action for believers and a stark warning to others.
Okay. So, wrapping up our deep dive today, we've looked at how these sources paint a picture of Allah as vigilant, punitive, demanding obedience.
We've explored how salvation is presented tied to submission and deeds, with uncertainty, but with jihad offered as a significant, guaranteed path to paradise.
And we've touched on the potential real-world consequences in the analysis, from conflict in places like Syria to dynamics within Western societies.
It really makes you consider the impact of a theological system where divine favor and striving, potentially violent striving, are so closely linked.
Yeah, it's definitely contrast to models based purely on grace or faith.
So maybe the final thought to leave with everyone is this. How should we, as individuals and societies, understand and engage with these theological ideas today?
Something to reflect on. Definitely worth digging into the sources if people want to explore further.